Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Conrad from Florida Atlantic University. I'm going to be talking about Jesuit and sexual economies in colonial San Juan de Puerto Rico today. And so, when we think about the Society of Jesus in the early modern world, we tend to think of a remarkable success story, right? We think about the great colleges of Mexico City, Lima, missionary networks stretching from Europe to Asia and the Americas, obviously, and of a religious order that became one of the most influential educational institutions of the early modern period. Yet today, I'd like to focus on what appears, at least at first glance, to be a bit of a failure when it comes to San Juan de Puerto Rico. So, why did one of the most successful religious orders of the early modern world leave such a faint imprint on colonial Puerto Rico? This question is particularly intriguing because San Juan shared many characteristics with other port cities where the Jesuits flourished. Think across the Atlantic world, cities such as obviously Lisbon, Seville, Naples, in the Mediterranean, Goa, in the Indian Ocean, Macau, Nagasaki, obviously, which is one of the clear examples, Salvador da Bahia, La Habana, Buenos Aires, and on and on and on. They all formed a dense network of ports to which people, goods, and idea circulated. So all of the cities, they really became those wealthy ports, those Puerto Ricos, no, very rapidly. Yet Puerto Rico was a bit of an exception, right? The Society of Jesus established colleges and missions in a lot of places, but not there. These cities were not simply administrative hubs. They were spaces where mobility generated constant encounters among merchants, sailors, soldiers, migrants, enslaved peoples, obviously missionaries, and just travelers, right? Among them, pirates. So they were also spaces of hybridity, and as Elena Valdez reminds us in her book Las Ciudades del Deseo, the cities of Havana, Santo Domingo, and San Juan de Puerto Rico frequently disarticulate those binaries that we have traditionally associated, right? Colonial categories of race, of sexuality, of morality, and identity often proved less stable in practice than colonial authorities wished them to be. It is within this environment of circulation and social mixing that colonial San Juan must be situated. So, my argument today is that the fragility of the first Jesuit presence in Puerto Rico cannot be explained simply by the expulsion of the order in 1767 or by a lack of institutional resources. Rather, it reflects the limits of Jesuit strategies within a city whose prosperity depended upon mobility, transience, and informal exchanges. So the relationship between Jesuit institutions and the sexual economies of San Juan provides a particularly revealing lens to which I would like to understand these limits. Colonial San Juan occupied a curious position within the Spanish Empire. It was strategically important, but intellectually peripheral. It was wealthy through commerce, but often treated as a temporary stop, gas station, rather than a destination, right? Ships arriving from Europe, especially from Spain, frequently stopped in Puerto Rico before continuing on to Mexico, Peru, Cartagena de las Indias, or other mainland colonies, right? In many ways, the island functioned as a point of passage within larger imperial networks. So, in his Historia General de Puerto Rico, the late Jesuit historian Fernando Pico famously describes San Juan as economically parasitic, right? As a parasite in relation to the rest of the island. So the city looked outward toward Atlantic circulation a lot more than inward toward local production, right? It really didn't seem to care much about the well being of the rest of the island. More recently, in 2025, another historian, Joel Melendez Badillo, published sort of revised history of the city in the island and captured the same mentality identified by Pico, but he describes it in different terms, right? He notes that many settlers just dreamed of leaving Puerto Rico altogether pretty soon after they would get there, right? The phrase, "May God take me to Peru," became surprisingly common among colonists. So one can hardly imagine a more revealing slogan for a society defined by mobility. This transience shaped the urban environment. At the center of the city stood institutions dedicated to military defense, to governance, and religious instruction, obviously. Yet, surrounding these official structures existed taverns, warehouses to keep the goods, to secure the goods, lodging houses, obviously, docks, and commercial districts animated by transient populations. The worlds of authority and informality are therefore existing side by side, right? So, one of the goals of this project has been to map these overlapping zones of activity in order to understand how moral regulation, commerce, and sexual economies interacted within the same urban landscape. The resulting picture, which is very theoretical here, reveals a city where formal institutions coexisted with social practices that continually challenge official efforts at classification and control. So the archive itself reflects this tension, right? A revealing example appears in a 1644 letter written by the bishop Damian Lopez de Arro. So that's shortly after his arrival in Puerto Rico, and he's writing to his friend Juan Diaz de la Calle. He is acknowledging that he has learned a great deal about local sexual practices, but he declines to describe them, right? Explaining that son tan siniestras las relaciones de lo que allá me dijeron. No, the stories, in other words, were simply too scandalous to be recorded, right? And for historians, for comparatists, this creates a familiar challenge. The people who knew the most often left behind the least documentation. Yet it is well known, sexual economies emerged very early in the history of San Juan. This should not surprise us. I mean, like many colonial ports, San Juan was overwhelmingly male during its early centuries, right? Again, soldiers, sailors, pirates, buccaneers, merchants, laborers, and travelers of all kinds, missionaries, obviously. They greatly outnumbered women when the city was founded. So such demographic conditions frequently generated prostitution and other forms of transactional sexuality. So if we turn to ecclesiastical records, we see a lot of references to mujeres públicas, right? So this illicit sexual behavior and scandalous houses, public women. Yet, sex work initially appeared less as a legal category than a recurring social reality. Authorities condemned it while simultaneously tolerating its existence, right? It's obvious in the archive. As Radot Rangelova observes, right, and I quote, the brothel, they are served not only as a site of economic exchange, but also as a space where masculinity and patriarchal authority were constructed and validated, right? So that's, end of quote. The brothel was therefore not merely a marginal institution. It occupied a central position within the social world of the colonial port. So importantly, recent scholarship encourages to move a little bit beyond a purely female-centered understanding of these colonial sexual economies, right? Municipal, judicial, and ecclesiastical records point toward a more complex landscape involving both female and male transactional sexuality. These activities concentrated around the same spaces associated with circulation. So again, we're talking about the docks, the military quarters, the taverns, and the lodging houses, right? So the geography of sexuality mirrored the geography of mobility. And this observation is particularly important because it allows us to see sexual economies not as an isolated deviation, right, from social norms, but as an integral component of urban life in this Atlantic port city. By the 17th century, sexual economies had become a persistent feature of life in San Juan. Colonial authorities repeatedly attempted to regulate them, but regulation remained selective rather than systematic, right? So this pattern reflected broader practices throughout the Spanish Empire. Officials generally intervened only when sexual commerce threatened public order, offended elite sensibilities, or generated sustained ecclesiastical pressure. Otherwise, authorities often tolerated practices they officially condemned, right? But the contradiction is revealing. Official discourse denounced prostitution, urban reality completely depended upon it. So if we follow the work of Michel Foucault and one of his followers, and Laura Stoller, we can understand now sexuality as a central site of governance. As Stoller famously writes, right, and I quote, the gender-specific sexual sanctions were squarely at the heart of imperial rule, end of quote. So colonial authorities sought to regulate intimacy because intimacy was inseparable from questions of race, of status, of family formation, and social order, right? Jesuit intervention must therefore be understood not simply as a religious activity, but also as a form of colonial governance. Through confession, through preaching, education, and spiritual direction, through those four methods, but especially confessions, the Jesuits attempted to shape behavior and produce disciplined Christian subjects. The question, however, is whether such efforts could succeed in a city defined by constant mobility and social mixing. The Jesuit presence in Puerto Rico is remarkable precisely because it was so limited. Unlike New Spain, Peru, Paraguay, Puerto Rico never became a major Jesuit center. Right? The order maintained only a very modest urban presence concentrated within the Old San Juan itself at the beginning. Their activities focused primarily on elite education. But again, when you have a transient elite, it's complicated. Religious instruction and pastoral care. So the society's educational philosophy was very straightforward. Form future leaders and society itself would be transformed, right? So elsewhere, this strategy proved remarkably successful. But San Juan de Puerto Rico presented unusual challenges. The city functioned less as a stable colonial center than a node within larger Atlantic networks. See, the residents arrived and departed constantly. The travelers passed through. Even Jesuits often viewed Puerto Rico as a temporary assignment rather than a final destination and always hoping for a better spot, right? So the result is an institutional history that survives largely through fragments, right? Scattered references and archival traces. In many ways, the first Jesuit presence in Puerto Rico remains a historical enigma for me. Yet this is this very fragility makes it historically significant, right? I believe the failure of the Jesuits to establish lasting roots in Puerto Rico reveals something important not only about the society itself, but about the city in which it operated. It would be a mistake, however, to imagine that Jesuits focused exclusively on colonial elites. From their beginnings, they cultivated also a pastoral tradition that emphasized engagement with marginalized populations. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit orders, himself supported charitable initiatives directed towards sex workers, towards prostitutes in the early modern period, and other socially vulnerable groups outside of them. So throughout Europe and the Americas, the Jesuits participated in efforts that combine, obviously, confession, but also quickly moving into a counseling, into a medical assistance and care, and social reintegration. So institutions such as the Casa Santa Marta in Rome, right, structured to care for sex workers attached to the mother church of the Society of Jesus, illustrate this tradition, right? The proximity to prostitution was therefore never accidental when it comes to the Jesuits. It was part of a broader pastoral strategy that we could still observe until recently when Pope Francis went in the areas of Rome where to engage in conversation with sex workers. So the Jesuits always believed that moral reform required engagement with both the powerful, the elite, and also with the marginalized, right? So they worked simultaneously with governors, kings, and also with beggars and merchants and prostitutes, future administrators, as well as social outcasts, right? To know all ends of society. So as Eileen Suarez Finlay reminds us in her book, Imposing Decency from 1999, sexuality remained central to debates about race, politics, economics, and social order in Puerto Rico. The regulation of sexuality, there as everywhere, was never simply about morality. It was also about power. So confession played a particularly important role in this process, as you can imagine. So as scholars such as Asuncion Larvin, Catherine Burns, and Martin Nesvig have demonstrated recently, the confessional functioned not merely as a sacramental space, but also as a site where sexuality, race, authority, and colonial governance intersected. So Jesuits hoped that confession would produce order, right? The port, meanwhile, continued producing new forms of disorder, right? One begins to see the structural problem here for the Jesuit. The society excelled at forming disciplined communities, and San Juan excelled at generating movement, ambiguity, and social mixing. So these two realities did not always coexist comfortably, right? The Jesuits could not build a stable mission on such quicksand. So the global expulsion of the Jesuits in 1767 marked the formal end of their presence, their very scattered presence in Puerto Rico. Yet the fragility of the Jesuit project preceded royal policy. San Juan's social organization already limited the effectiveness of long-term institutional control. The neighborhoods surrounding the docks remained a space of mobility and hybridity. Sailors, merchants, migrants, laborers, smugglers, soldiers, they continued to circulate throughout the city, and these districts were not merely spaces of vice, right? They were spaces where colonial categories themselves became unstable and mestizaje happened. Evidence also points toward forms of male transactional sexuality and same-sex sociability that have received relatively little attention in the historiography of Puerto Rico. But as a military port with a disproportionately male population, San Juan shared characteristic with many other Atlantic cities where such practices existed within broader networks of labor, of patronage, and mobility. So these realities often remain difficult to document precisely because they were difficult for local authorities themselves to classify. So the archive mirrors the city's ambiguity. Many forms of desire, exchange, and sociability remain resistant to institutional control. The same city that challenged civil authorities also challenged ecclesiastical orders, right, and the structures. So ultimately, the disappearance of the first Jesuit project in Puerto Rico should not be understood simply as a historical accident, right? Rather, San Juan reveals a structural contradiction at the heart of the Jesuit urban apostolate. Right, the Society of Jesus depended upon engagement with the most dynamic and morally ambiguous spaces of the early modern world. Yet, those same spaces continually resisted the forms of order the Jesuit hoped to create. Puerto Rico no se dejó. The most revealing aspect of this history may be what happened afterwards, when the Jesuits returned during the 19th century and established institution in Santurce, right? So outside of the old fortified city where San Juan continued to develop. They did so under very different urban conditions this time. The expansion of San Juan de Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rican capital, beyond this old district to the east ended the parasitic relationship between the city and the rest of the island, at least a little bit. At the same time, the earlier colonial experiences largely disappeared from institutional memory, right? It was in many respects a first arrival for the Jesuits, right? The official first. Let's forget about what happened before, right? It's not even really documented. So as San Juan expanded with Santurce, the memory of the earlier Jesuit presence faded from view, right? So recovering this forgotten history allows us to see colonial Puerto Rico differently, right? Not simply as a military outpost or a commercial port, but as a city where mobility, sexuality, confession, commerce, and mestizaje intersected in ways that continually challenged institutional authority. The Jesuit tried and failed to transform the city before the 19th century. Instead, the city transformed the conditions under which the Jesuit could operate. And that perhaps is the most revealing lesson of this forgotten encounter.